This week's episode, we're going to be talking about prep, and we're going to be talking about prepping for your adventure as a game master. And some people might wonder just how much you need to put into it. Well, if you didn't have to put any into it, there wouldn't be Dungeon Master's guides, there wouldn't be DM's resources, there wouldn't be all these things that are catered specifically to get you to where you can DM your campaign effectively. Okay, you all fight for position. Hello and welcome to Game Mastery. I'm Steve.
I'm Andrew.
And I'm Mark.
I often wonder how people do this from the game master perspective as a player, because the only kind of analog that I have to it is preparing for a presentation or to teach a workshop. And so what I do in those cases is I have documentation that I have created, and I take that documentation and I make it such that if I'm not there, the people in my class or the people who want to see what I'm going to be talking about can get everything that I would have told them that's important from those notes. But what I do in person is I use those as an outline to refer to. And I pretty much wing 90% of what I do. I know the material, I have an intimate knowledge of it, so I can call upon that and I can freestyle rather effectively. It appears that there are different takes on how to do this in long form and short form campaigns. So what do you guys think about that? What is the best way? How do you handle it? Is it different short? Is it different long? What do we got? Mark.
As for prepping in general, I generally be sure that I have, like you said, an outline, more or less, of just what's going to happen. Some scenes that you're going to set up are pretty simple. You don't really need a whole lot. Other stuff you can, sometimes you need a little bit more. If you're running a dungeon or something, you're going to need to have a map for your dungeon, how you want it to look. Generally, I'll have a list of NPC names that I can use if I need some on the fly. But, as far as prepping your adventure, it's generally just the minimum you need. There's a certain amount of time investment that you want to minimize. So I try to waste as little time as I can when prepping an adventure. Just get what you need. That is the most important thing.
Now, Andrew, I know that in a lot of situations, you are about an economy of movement and of making sure that your efforts have been best served with the actions that you take. How do you feel about prepping and how much time you put into it? And is it different in electronic or in person? All these things. I'll just let you go with that general question.
I think the degree of preparation that a DM should target, and you won't get there without some experience because you have no baseline to measure right off the bat. You need more time doing adventures, doing prep to sort of get a feel for how much you need. But a good rule of thumb is that I want to do as much prep as necessary so that I don't have to spend time looking things up or pausing the flow of action to find details. If I'm running an adventure or an encounter and I have to pause because I need to figure out what this NPC's abilities are or what their motives are or what information they're supposed to relay the party, and the flow of the adventure sort of halts at that point because I'm digging up more information, then I didn't prep enough. And so I want to prep as much as I can so that the game runs more efficiently. If my game's got lots of hiccups and lots of starts along the way where we make a stop and I have to look something up, or I figure out that I've left out a whole section of the plot that was important to be revealed earlier because I didn't prep enough, then I know next time I need to put a little bit more effort into doing that. And there are some systems in place to accomplish that goal that we can discuss a little later. Clearly, the difference between having an adventure you've created, a world in which you are the author, is different than the requirements of prepping someone else's adventure, something somebody else published. Because when you're working from your own creation, you do know that probably pretty intimately. You already have an idea how things are going to flow and who the characters are in your world. But if you're using a published adventure, then you need to spend a little time becoming familiar with that world and understanding how the elements and the different factions interrelate.
Okay, so help me out a little bit here, because when I was thinking about it earlier at the beginning of our episode and talking about it, and I was thinking about what I bring and what I have to create, I imagined in a way that I was taking notes, that what I was essentially creating, if I was going to take my process for real life and apply it to an already made game, a scripted campaign, would be that without having this experience, I would expect that I would have to create my own notes on that campaign in order for me to be effective. Back in the day when I was playing Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, I didn't have to mark any pages. I didn't have to earmark anything. I didn't have to have any reference. I had an encyclopedic knowledge of what was in that book and on what page and how the mechanics were. I can't do that anymore. I don't know if there's a certain time in your life where there's a small window when you can accomplish feats like that, but it kind of scares me a little bit to have to dive into one of these really expansive and, to me, daunting adventures, hard-bound adventure for Dungeons and Dragons now, let's say, and think about just diving into it. How do you feel that those adventures, do they adequately prepare someone who might not be the strongest DM going into it? And how can they work to effectively GM that for their party?
Well, for your own world, not necessarily for a published one,
Mm-hmm.
but there's things that you can have ready. For example, if you know that you're going to be in the water and you aren't super familiar with the drowning rules, the rules on swimming, stuff like that, I will generally just put that in my notes. Just have a copy of it right there so that I don't have to worry about that, because you can foresee the sort of rules that you might have problems with or need to know for a particular situation. Maybe don't come up all the time, so you don't have them, in your head.
Yeah, I think the advantage and disadvantage system and just knowing to pick an ability and being able to set difficulty scores, that sort of thing, you can skate through some of that if you come up with something that you don't know. You can keep the action going merely by saying, give me an athletics check for this swim, give me a constitution check for, holding your breath, and applying advantage and disadvantage based on the difficulty and assigning a difficulty value to that experience. So the rules in 5e have made it very easy to fudge formal, standard operating procedure for a particular swimming encounter, that sort of thing. I think that the danger for me is forgetting elements of the plot, especially in a published adventure. If it's my own world, then I know because I've created it. I've got that familiarity. I know who this character is, why he's in this story, what the purpose of his encounter is. But when you're running it from somebody else's story, if you don't understand where this character fits in the overarching story, it's very easy to leave out key elements of the plot. And it can give the party the perception that things are just random, that there is no connection between elements if you don't have these elements to pull in and tie in. It's not so much that the party doesn't enjoy the combat or the discovery of a particular item or even the dialogue and banter between themselves and the NPCs. It's that they become disconnected from the overarching goals of the story or where the story is going or the different paths that it could take because key elements are left out. And I think that that's the real purpose of prepping, is so that you understand all of the possible interactions between these characters.
That's why I never really understood the purpose of pre-published adventures. Like for me, because they actually seem harder to run because you don't know everything than, for your own stuff where you're intimately familiar with it. So, for me, the only time I've ever run a pre-published adventure is just for one shot whenever I literally had no prep whatsoever and I just did it straight from the book because people wanted to play that night, were never prepared for it or anything. So that's the only use I've ever had.
I think there's an illusion of time invested. If you've created the world and you've created the story, then you've invested time in that creation process. The same time that you spent creating the world and placing NPCs and thinking about their backstory and understanding how they relate to one another and what their competing interests are, what particular special abilities they might have, all of that time could be spent just prepping an existing adventure and becoming familiar with it. So I don't know that there's that much of a time, especially I think that the argument that, well, I would rather just build my own than I would to prep, well, that's fair. You can do that, but I don't know that it's necessarily more time to prep. In fact, I would argue it's probably a lot less time. It's just that you're probably prepping, let me say, you're probably building your adventure while you're walking the aisles in the grocery store and you're in the shower and you're sort of daydreaming about your world and how it all fits together. And you're doing that in a different context than you would be if you're sitting down with a book and you're sort of digesting it and trying to figure out what this pre-published adventure means. Steve had asked a question on whether or not these published adventures, they're daunting and whether they actually do help a DM. And I would say that the early hardbound editions for 5e, especially Hoard of the Dragon Queen, Rise of Tiamat series, was a horrible adventure for a new DM. It is a great challenge for a DM who's wanting to stretch out on their own because it left so much to be built upon. It left so much to be filled out. And the plot was, although it seemed linear to the players, it is very complicated. It involves every single faction that you can imagine in D&D plus some. All of the Lords of Waterdeep have their own motivations. All of the Order of the Gauntlet, the Emerald Enclave, the Harpers, the Zentarum, they all play a role in that story and they all have their own agents. And so there's probably 20 or 30 key NPCs that all have their own interests. And satisfying those interests is key to the story. You can't complete it without addressing them all and kind of they actually have a sheet at the back so you can have a scorecard for all of these different factions. It's a nightmare for a brand new DM. I would never recommend that for a brand new DM. However, if you've done some of the later published adventures that are better organized, then it can be a good challenge to polish your skills as a DM, especially if you're wanting to sort of gradually transition into creating your own world, because it gives you a foundation, it gives you sort of a base, and you can build off that to sort of create these little more detailed encounters, more detailed side adventures, if you will, from that core published book.
I think for me, the problem is that half the reason I DM is because I want to build my own things, and studying somebody else's stuff feels like work to me. It's less of a game, so
I fully get that. And the reason I DM is because all of my friends are too lazy to DM.
Ouch.
that makes sense. That was why I started, because I was like, well, if I want to play, there's no way other people are going to do this, so I better learn myself. So that was how I started. My first game ever was as a DM. It was horrible,
Oh,
but I'd never even played before I just started DMing one.
holy crow, that's a terrible burden. One of the problems that I have, because I've only DM'd really 3 games, and that's it. I never felt I had an opportunity when I was growing up with the group that I had, and I know that they're partially hurt to know that, but I just didn't feel like that it was my arena to step in. And after having played so much, my feeling is that I want to create these worlds all to myself. and I want to do all of the creation myself. And I think maybe that's a narrow view on my part, because I think my ideas would be so much better if I could only do them. But I can only really effectively learn how to do them by doing. And I hate that. I hate that. So if I was going to take an adventure, Andrew, specifically, you're saying that the later 5th edition modules have gotten so much better that that's where you should start if you're looking for one to run, rather than just the cheapest one on the shelf, but actually look at the date.
Yeah, in fact, there are some Adventure League adventures that you can find online that they have done. Adventure League is a Wizards of the Coast tool where you can join a game and then come and go to another comic book shop or whatever and join a game there with your same character, and the characters transfer. The DM sort of signs off that this game was played by a pretty strict set of rules, and you can join adventures in others. And so your character, if you're not able to make it every week to one particular game, you can sort of hop around from game to game and join in adventures to build your character out and navigate through. And they publish some supplemental adventures that fit this strict rule set. They're short. Typically, the these little external adventures are built for 3 to 4 hours of play. They're designed to be played from beginning to end in one sitting. They are really well executed. They even include flowcharts in the published material so that the DM can quickly sort of assemble this. It's not a lot of complex plot. It still fits into the overarching story. It's a way for characters and players to get some experience with the game, acquire a few magic items, build some experience. If you miss out a week and you didn't level up with your party, you could join one of these Adventure League games.
So you're saying that if a beginning DM is starting, those would be the adventures to pick up Adventure League supplements?
These Adventure League supplements, now that we're like in season 10, there's been 10 different published adventures. And for every published adventure, there are about 10 Adventure League sub-adventures, little 3-hour one-shot kind of things that will fit, that you can, show up and run. Those, especially the later ones, are really well done as far as giving a DM everything they need to quickly get up to speed and run the game. I would start with one of those for sure. They're pretty much prepped for you. They're self-contained, and the content really is well organized for a brand new DM.
That's excellent. I've never run a pre-published thing that wasn't a one shot. So
I've been playing Tyranny, which is Tyranny of the Dragons, is both the Horde of the Dragon Queen and the Tiamat. So it's a 0 to 15, 0 to 17 adventure campaign from beginning to end. And we are a year and a half in on that, playing almost every Sunday for 3 or 4 hours. One of those little $50 books is a lot of content, but that's not the one I would recommend getting. It's a complex adventure. There are much easier ones to do.
So as an experienced DM, who I'm assuming you've created your own worlds and everything.
When I was younger, once I got a job,
So what's the appeal of the pre-published adventure as opposed to
time, just really the time of having to, think of the plot, think of the story. And I still do that to some extent right now in my Wednesday night game that I've got. It's set in Undermountain, and they're in Skullport. The last 3 sessions have been adventure seeds that I've taken advantage of, but the entire creation for the last 3 or 4 sessions has been all mine. I've got an NPC that has been traveling with the party for several months, and she's a very minor character in the published adventure, but I've kind of built her into this sort of arc that I've got in my own head. So it's not just the published adventure. I've got my own little side thing going that sort of feeds back into the main story. But it really just has to do with time. I don't have the time to commit every single session, and I don't like to have a bad session. So knowing that I've got if I've got a week where I only have an hour or two to prep, then I can fall back on the published material, polish up on that, run that, and if I've got a little extra time, then I can sort of take off and do my own thing to sort of make it feel fuller.
That's fascinating because my experience has been wildly different where, I think that if I wasn't making my own world, I wouldn't want to do it. For me, yeah, my familiarity with any world, like, the Forgotten Realms or any of that is solely because I played Baldur's Gate. Like, I don't know anything about any of that because I've always just run my own worlds.
There ain't nothing wrong with Baldur's Gate.
I think also that it may be easier, maybe it might be easier on the players that have some experience with Faerun, that they understand the Forgotten Realms and they understand who the Pantheon is and they understand what role Waterdeep has and they understand, the Masked Lords and how they relate and they understand Neverwinter and they know the geography of the world.
That's one of the reasons that I don't run it in any pre-published world where people can question what's happening in the world because they will know it better than I do. Nobody knows the worlds that I create better than I do, so they're not going to have any room to say, hey, the Red Wizards of Thay wouldn't do this, whereas I don't even know who they are. So
I've never had that happen where I had somebody call me out on, and I mean probably it's because my adventures may be a little shallow. I don't really get into too much. It's very much a fuzzy backdrop in my world. But the general locations, the governance, the pantheon, having that sort of already pre-made for me where I don't have to build that out. And I know that in games that I've played where I wasn't familiar, I felt like I needed to almost research, who is this cleric's god? What's their motivation and how does magic working in this world? And it's more work than I wanted to have than as a player. I would think that my character would know this already because they're there and they grew up in this world. So having to discover it as a player can sometimes be a little frustrating.
I can see that. I really try to integrate all that stuff as much as I can and as fluidly as possible into it. And outside of like some random goodie that they might get by knowing my world better, I do have I always make a booklet for people who are interested in reading about the world, but if not, then I'm happy to provide that information because their characters would know it. So, you can just provide that on the fly. That's not a big deal, unless I guess you're a frustrating DM who really wants the players to just have memorized your booklet or whatever. So for me, it's also different because whenever you're creating your own world, your own adventure, everything like that, you're going to, like you said, that time is, it's shower time. It's driving to somewhere time. It's not like sitting down with a book and trying to go into something that you haven't that you're only somewhat familiar with. So for me, I feel like while it might take more time overall, it's sort of like a lot of it is time you're doing other things. So in a lot of ways, I think it's kind of less time to be creating your own thing because once again, you're familiar with it, you know what's going on. You need a rough outline of what you want to accomplish, and then all that's really left that you have to be sitting down and writing out is the outline and just like the stat blocks or whatever you need to be doing that. The rest of it is time you're doing something else. So for me, and maybe that comes with experience, but for me that's less time.
I can't keep at least I can't keep all of that stuff in my head. So there's at some point I've got to sit down and I've got to write it out. I've got to, kind of create this journal of NPCs and plot and where I want it to flow. And I might be able to swing it for one or two adventures kind of by the seat of my pants. But I need to have things that I can go back and refer to. I need to build a map. I need to be thinking about the pantheon of the world. What gods do the clerics worship? Where do the mages get their power? What are the political conflicts? What is the industry that has created this city or town, and how is that? All of that stuff that you have to build. Now, once you've already kind of got that core, you can build from that, I guess. But there was still a lot of investment to get there, and that's just a lot of effort. That is just a huge amount of effort to be able to take, Ed Greenwood's world and build upon it, and just, let that be the backdrop, and not have to worry about, coming up with why is Baldur's Gate where it is, and what are the circumstances for, why its politics are the way it is, or the economy.
Well, you only need certain aspects of that, like, for example, there's a town on a river. Okay, you know what's going on there. You know that there's going to be some river trade, and you can understand why the city's there, and you don't really need to provide much more thought, especially if it's a place where they're just passing through. You know what I mean? Like, if you're going to have a city as the center of your adventure, then yeah, you're really going to want to flesh out that city. But in general, most places aren't like that. You flesh out what's necessary for the plot, and if something unexpected comes up, you just kind of wing it, and then now you know. You make something up, and then now you know.
But are you really winging it?
Yeah.
I would suggest that you probably have had other adventures, other experiences that you're pulling from to sort of throw in there. And because you have experience DMing, you can go back to, and maybe it's an unconscious thing, you go back to a previous encounter, or you go back to a previous dynamic for the NPCs, or you go back to a previous town that you've run, and you pull bits and pieces of those to flesh out that moment. But a novice DM does not have that backdrop.
It could be, but before that, what did I do? Well, I read novels,
Which was prep.
I mean, I guess, but that's what I did as a kid. And I think that, certainly people have read or watched things that they can draw from, or they understand something about the world. Your new DM isn't like a brand new baby in the world. They are the DMing, but they have other experiences, other things that they can use to draw from.
In reading, I believe in we're kind of going afield of prepping for adventures and kind of diving more into a debate about the adventures themselves and pros and cons versus created and creation. And because we've been doing that, I've been thinking about the novice GM, the person who's coming to it for the first time. And I know that when I came into gaming, I already had a wealth of reading experience. And as I gamed, my reading experience became greater and more broad. But the problem with it is you're digesting those stories as entertainment. And they are artifacts of action and interaction. Whereas when you are about to DM and create a campaign and create a world, you don't just have to have a concept of story, but you have to have a concept of the flow of that journey. And there's a lady by the name of Nancy Duarte, and she teaches presentations. She's amazing. And she did a whole thing where she I don't even know how to put it. She dissected great speeches. Everything from Abraham Lincoln, JFK, Martin Luther King, all of these people that had speeches that inspired and have kind of stood the test of time. And she dissected them in a way that it created a sawtooth pattern of ups, acrosses, downs, acrosses, ups.
So she made the hero's journey, like Joseph Campbell for speeches.
Right. for speeches. And it's fascinating. And she has a series of TED Talks. I suggest anybody listen to them. She's just one of my favorite online people. I love her and I love her work. So having an idea of how to drag your audience along with you and where to put those obstacles in their path that seem insurmountable, and then giving them the opportunity to move past it and feel like they've accomplished something before the next pitfall, and then the next struggle, and the next ascent. Being able to do that as a starting DM is difficult. Being able to do that as a beginning author is difficult. And so I can see where, as a beginning GM, that I would definitely think that the miniature adventures that Andrew's talking about would be a fantastic way for them to get a feel in a truncated 3 to 4 hour bite of how to drag characters along, give them obstacles, see them push through so that they're hungry for the next, and they just keep going over these like waves. I don't know how effective people can do that on their own. However, I do think that if you've got this breadth of knowledge from reading, that when you are applying yourself to this ready-made adventure, it will make you a more effective GM, because you can identify the pieces, you can play out those pieces more effectively, you know those themes, and then it kind of acts as a help. Both of them build on each other so that you get to the point where you are Mark, and you would much rather do things on your own, and you've got this solid background of how things are proven to work, mated with how you want them to work.
It's interesting because I really came into this, I guess, ass backwards. Because for me, like I said, I started out DMing and I started out creating my own worlds and I started out doing everything from scratch. For me, it's weird because it was always me doing some sort of experimental thing to see what worked. Like, I've done things that DMs should never ever do, like 10-player campaign operated by just me, and splitting campaigns into 2 or 3 parts, like different sessions, and then having them collide sometimes. And for me, it was just a whole process of experimentation and doing things differently and learning that way. Like I said, I've only ever run a few pre-published things, and that was just whenever I literally had no time to do anything at all.
You are, as they would say, an odd duck when it comes to how you came to DMing and what you did to provide that experience for the people that you were with, partly because it seems like out of necessity that you were placed into this and you had to adapt. But it wasn't easy, was it?
No, not even a little bit. Because there's lots of wrong ways to do it. And there's lots of okay ways to do it. And I think that even if you started from pre-published things, unless that was just like what you were starting with, I think that it will take you a while either way to find your style and to find what works for you. And, to this day, still every campaign I'm running some experimental thing. Like, one time I made a online quiz, like a choose your own journey thing, and that was how people's attributes were generated. And I've run campaigns where the PCs were children and in an orphanage, and I've tried so many different ways, and every time I DM, you're going to see me fall flat on my face on some sessions because I'm just trying something new or wild, a different way to make a puzzle, a different way to do something, because I'm trying to learn about the craft really of it and see what works and what doesn't just through my own experience.
I think something that would be cool to do would be if we would take an upcoming episode, and we would craft from start to finish in an hour a campaign setting a goal, a set of NPCs, and an outline to see what it would take to come up with that in an hour amongst 3 people with differing gaming experiences and proclivities. I just wanted to say proclivity. I love that word. It makes me smile. So, Andrew, when you do this, when you know that you're going to be dealing with players, you're going to have this new adventure to set up, what are the steps that you take initially to prepare with that source material?
I start off by scanning the whole adventure. It is a sort of a quick read, hitting the main plot points, looking at the chapter titles, looking at the conclusions. Usually, there in the published adventures, there's this the final paragraph in every chapter is this what happens next. And so I just sort of skim through those, read them, so I have a general idea of what the flow of the plot is. What's the final goal? How does everything, what are the sort of the key elements, and just get a feel for it. I kind of skip over the individual room contents and I try to focus on the little background paragraphs, how these things, what the objectives are, kind of included in the beginning of each chapter before they start breaking down the locations and specific NPC detail. Some of the older ones I mentioned, Tyranny of Dragons. If you tried to run that adventure without doing a pre-read, they included things you needed to know as an aside, an afterthought, midway through the chapter. And so you would be halfway through and you would have missed this whole section on that if the PCs chose this option, you were to handle things differently early on. And so you definitely have to scan the whole thing and look for those little out of place bits. Then ask yourself, what is the final encounter? Who is the boss? What's the boss fight about? And then sort of search through the text to find the elements that make that encounter possible. What must the characters do? What must the characters encounter? What must the characters acquire for that encounter to take place? And then I repeat the process for each one of those elements. It might be that to get to the boss fight, they have to have a particular magic item. And so there will be a sub adventure based around that magic item. You need to track that down and figure out where that falls into play. What are the consequences for failing to get those items? And what are the backup plans to sort of get this thing to flow forward? Just a rough outline in my head. It's usually inaccurate to a large degree when I first scan it, and I don't worry about it being too inaccurate at that stage. There are some tips that I have borrowed from my professional life, and one of these comes from this guy named Eric Shepard, who wrote an interviewing model for law enforcement, criminal investigations, how to interview someone, how to read somebody's statement, and build out a detailed accounting of this. And his goal wasn't to present this to someone else where you would have notes. The goal of this is to have a deep understanding of the events so that you could solve a crime, so that you could understand how the characters interacted, what the history of the weapon was and how that flowed into the particular scene, or what was the motive of the particular actors. Why would they lie, or why would they mislead? Why would they be there? And so to understand that, as opposed to just going through an outline and regurgitating that outline to somebody else, you have to have an ingrained understanding of the event, or you'll lose track of the narrative or the potential narratives that are in play. So he developed this method. He borrowed it, I think, from this 1940s study method called the SQ3R. And it was like study or scan, survey, question, and then read, repeat, and recite. And I may have those SQ3Rs. I'm not very familiar with that particular method, but that's kind of where this tool comes from. That's its origins. And he shifted this around so that a investigator could get a deep understanding of a narrative, a deep understanding of a story based on lots of different inputs from the crime scene, inputs from other individuals. And he calls it the SE3R. And this stands for scan, extract, read, review, and respond. And essentially what you do is you scan the text like I described. And in this method, you create a timeline. You turn your note paper sideways, you draw a line across the page, just as if you were drawing out a timeline. And you mark on this timeline key plot elements, key things that have happened on the timeline. And this lets you know when you're trying to understand the flow of things that the order of these events, what came first, what was necessary, how these things relate. Another element in his model is to have what he calls knowledge bins. He's a Brit, so he uses the term bins, but he uses, they're like little note cards. He uses a section on the page at the bottom of below the timeline, but you could use a note card or a separate sheet. And every character, every item, every place gets a note card, gets a knowledge bin, and you jot down the facts about this particular element. So it might be that you're going to describe Tiamat, and so you need to female identity, mother of dragons, this five-headed god on the first plane of hell, doesn't want to be there. But you just mark down these little notes on Tiamat. She would get her own card. And then you might describe a cultist that is key to the story, and you would create a card for that particular cultist.
Sounds like a pen and paper wiki.
Yes, exactly. It is exactly that. And so you scan and you jot down stuff really quick, the things that pop out very up, right away to you, that this is sort of the flow and what you think it is, and you pencil that in. Then you go back and this time you take a slow read and you fill in the details on your timeline. Okay, the characters, for example, they need to approach this particular area. They need to make these observations to advance. And if they don't make these observations, this is going to happen. And so characters make observations. That's going to be another plot point in the timeline. Characters enter the area. Characters, trip a trap, or they solve a puzzle, or these key elements that are going to occur along the timeline, or that may occur. It might be that the characters skip this part of the plot, and that's fine, but you need to know that these elements exist in the line. So when you're presenting the story, you don't miss out on some key element. You don't skip over something by accident, which is so easily done in a published adventure. You might need to have sort of these notes on continuing activities, and simply that's just you put a little hash mark on the line, and then you draw a horizontal line parallel to the timeline and write what's continuing along that particular time frame. And so you extract all of the details that you possibly can. So you would go back and reread the sections on Tiamat and fill in the details, their immunities, the special tactics that they may use, the steps that they may do initially in combat. When are they going to break combat? What conditions may cause them to withdraw? What conditions might cause them to negotiate? And so you put these all in their little pieces. And so once you've extracted all of that, you put the text aside. You put the book away. And then you read your notes. You read along your timeline, and then you go through your knowledge bins, your little index cards of the details on each one of these characters. And then you think about, how am I going to present this material to the players? How am I going to describe this room? How am I going to describe this creature? How am I going to present this narrative? How this dialogue? How are these elements going to be presented? What are the attitudes of this NPC? Those things. So you're taking the raw material now and you're making it your own and trying to figure out what flavor you're going to give this encounter and how this encounter is going to engage the players. When you do that, you will identify, when you kind of do this dry run in your head, you'll identify key elements that you have omitted or that you don't know, or that was elements that weren't included in the text, things you overlooked or things that may not have been in there at all. The second to last encounter in Tyranny of Dragons involves the adventurers going to Thay and speaking with the Red Wizards. And it is a horribly written little chapter. I don't know anyone that likes it. I've tried to find some advice on beefing it up and making it more enjoyable. Everybody says it universally it's a poorly written section. But you are to engage these players selectively, a few of the players, which I think is odd, where you kind of isolate just a few members of the party, and they are to be questioned about their knowledge of Thay and their attitude toward the wizards and their attitude toward Zastam, who is the Lich Lord of the Red Wizards. And, well, your characters may never have encountered these Red Wizards before. They're not a key element in the plot. There are a few Red Wizards that are introduced, but the culture of Thay is definitely not part of the main adventure. And to ask these questions of the characters is awkward and it's out of place. And the text, as it's published, doesn't give you sample questions. It gives you some rules to navigate this questionnaire and some consequences if the characters fail the test, but it doesn't give you the nuts and bolts. So if you were to try to do this on the fly just by scanning it 30 minutes before the adventure, it would be a disaster, because you'd get to this question, you'd go, well, I don't know what the questions are. What am I supposed to ask them? It's not well thought out. In fact, even if you are familiar with the world, it takes considerable thought and planning to construct the dialogue that's necessary to fill out this section of the adventure. So when you go through, and to get back to our SE3R method, we're at this respond stage where we've reviewed our notes and we're filling in the gaps that don't make sense. And it's at this point you identify weak spots in the published adventure or weak spots in your notes where you didn't quite fill in the gaps, and you get a better idea of what the flow should be and what content you should be. You're sort of playing out the adventure ahead. And you mentioned this before earlier, Mark, about, if you know you're going to be in a watery environment, then you're going to need to think about the rules for swimming and underwater combat, and you need to sort of make some notes on those types of things. And it's at this respond stage of the process where you identify the additional information you need for this encounter to go smoothly. This method, once you've done it, is fairly quick, and you've got to consider that for any 3 to 5 hour adventure that you're going to run, 3 to 5 hour game session, you really only need 5 encounters. So you don't need to have a detailed timeline for everything. Probably you'd want to I do these sort of on a chapter by chapter basis. So I skim the entire book. I get a kind of a rough diagram. I do an SE3R for the entire text, but not in detail. And then I build out these little mini ones for each chapter in the text. So if I'm expecting the adventurers to get through, if you plan out 10 rooms that are all connected, 10 encounters in a flow, then you've probably got more than enough content for a 3 to 5 hour session. And knowing how these encounters fit together and how the dialogue's going to flow and what information you need to flesh it out, so that you're not having to pause the adventure and say, oh, hold on a second, I need to look something up. I need to see what I don't know what to do now. And especially on a published adventure, that can be a disaster, because it does grind the game to a halt and people can become bored and lost. So yeah, that's kind of my method for prepping. It's not so much prepping to make a presentation, it's kind of prepping to do surgery, where I don't want to have my patient cut open, working, and then go, oh, I need to check my notes and see what I need to do next. I want it to flow, and I don't feel like I've prepped enough if it doesn't flow from the beginning to end. I don't want to have to refer to my notes.
And that seriously takes you less time than making your own thing?
I'm a fast reader. And fair enough, I am a pretty fast reader, so.
He is a fast reader.
I'm a fast reader too, but...
As Andrew's talking about that, I'm thinking about there are many, many books that are written on how to read. There's one by Mortimer J. Adler, How to Read a Book. And it's something that was foreign to me because I would just read. But as a late teen and a young adult, I had such a hard time digesting text from textbooks, instructional books. There are books out there that actually give you tips on how to read these things to digest the information. And some of it parallels what Andrew was talking about going through the text and scanning it, trying to extract salient points, then building a kind of database for yourself of this information that you've found that seems relevant, and then getting to the end and looking at what the end says, and then going back through and reviewing the content and trying to put it all into the context of what you've built from the beginning of the chapter to the end. And it's a pain in the ass. It's a tremendous pain in the ass from someone who just wants to read. It's very frustrating for me. But there's some things that I can't digest without that kind of method. And I realize that if you were trying to provide this experience for your players and you were unfamiliar with the content, then you really do have to perform some of these steps in order to not screw it up. The goal is for, you to have a good time and them to have a good time. And
where Andrew's talking about, reading an adventure and really deeply digesting it. For me, it's about creating the area, creating the world that they're going to be in, and really digesting that up front before I ever start the campaign. Once I get that sort of in my head, then it's pretty easy to come up with characters and things for them to interact with. So as much as I can, I try and let the PCs really drive the action. I let them come up with interpersonal conflicts with other things, and that happen. Obviously, there's going to be random encounters, or they're navigating a boat in a swamp and there's a hydra or whatever. But a lot of the more major conflicts, I tend to try and let the PCs make it, and I want them to have real choice. I don't want to, fake choice, but it still gets them back to somewhere. And that's more of like that's more of an ideal I've set for myself, more so than them. Because you can fake players into the idea that they have choice whenever they don't. But for me, I try and make it real. I don't necessarily recommend that for other DMs, but it's something that I strive for.
I was thinking about it in relation to what Andrew was saying with, you don't want to mess things up. You don't want to break the action and have to go look something up. You don't want to have that moment where in the subject matter expert world, we refer to it as losing credibility. When you've lost credibility with your audience as to your aptitudes, then it takes away from whatever you're doing, your presentation, your class, whatever, your game. So I know what I do in the adventures that I've done where I have come to points where I'm like, boy, I need a breather and I need to stop and do something. How do you handle it when you reach a point in your game where you need to take a break for whatever reason? Whether it's to collect yourself, to think more clearly about what's going to come next, any of these roadblocks. Do you have anything in particular that you can think on that you fall back on so as not to lose credibility?
Well, there's a cheap trick that I've used when I needed a little additional time to read up when the players have changed direction and I wasn't quite ready for that direction change. There's a tactic that I use sparingly. I'll probably use it more sparingly now that it's going to be public knowledge. But it is a never fail tactic. And that is you have the magic dealer show up. At that point, every character, every player is researching what item they want. And you can get 5, 10, 15 minutes of scan ahead time while they are trying to decide what the best combination that they can get for whatever cash they've got. So
You throw a dealer into the mix.
I just changed their focus. Well, Steve, you've played in my campaign. What do you think about my prep or lack thereof? I mean, there have been times we've played and I have not been prepared necessarily.
Okay, so there have been times when you haven't been prepared, but your knowledge of the game and or the story is such that it's not a huge speed bump and the road isn't too terribly rough. Now, it may seem lacking on your end because you're the one having to drive the car, but from a player's perspective, I think your overall preparedness with the complete adventure pays off in spades when you reach the point that you have a lack of prep for that particular encounter or that evening. I know that there have been plenty of times where I've had groups just canceled because the person wasn't prepared for the encounters of that night.
Seriously?
Yes. Oh, yes. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. We've got to cancel. I'm not prepared for the encounters that you guys will be facing tonight. It's because there wasn't any prep work. There wasn't any prep work. There wasn't any initial prep work either. If there had been a rather exhaustive prep work at the beginning that Andrew talks about, then you can run any point of that adventure, without knowing everything about the encounter, but at least knowing where it fits in and who the players are and where it is in the timeline. And this is, an on rails thing for an adventure. But I've also had the same thing occur with people who are playing their own worlds, where they're just not prepared for it. Now, I've been not prepared for a game because I'm not familiar with the system, where I'm not ready to play in someone's game because I'm not ready with the system. And please let them cancel tonight. I'd really love to play, but I don't want to look like an idiot.
Man, that's the player's job. The player's job is to go in there wildly unprepared and just wing it. I mean, that's like with the fun of being a player. You don't have to be intimately familiar with the system. You say, all right, this is the kind of guy I want to be. And they'll be like, oh, well, then you want to do this. And you'll be like, all right. Being unprepared as a player should be normal and expected.
Well, I've played with quite a few groups that do not suffer noobs well, and they do not want someone who is not intimately familiar with the game because they don't want anybody asking questions. They don't want to have to help anybody. I mean, even when you're talking about experienced gamers who have years or decades of experience with other systems, there are groups that doesn't matter if you are not intimately familiar with their particular system.
I mean, how did they get intimately familiar? They played it a bunch, okay?
They did.
I think that is bullshit, and that makes very little sense. Everybody starts out not knowing anything, and you learn things as you have to meet them, right? So, you're a player in a system, say the hero system, right? Because I was a noob in that. I still kind of am. And I still don't really understand exactly how everything works. But I played in a game with it, and I just went in and I figured it out, at least enough to play it. And that it should be the norm. You go in to a game and you should be able to know literally nothing outside of like, all right, the general premise of the game is, this is your standard D&D thing, or this is the hero system, or whatever it is, right? You go in, and you should be able to play it. Now, that is not GMing it. The GM is responsible for so much more, and one of their primary responsibilities is taking players like you and getting them up and running. I can't see another way of doing it. If you like, how else do new people get introduced to the game? You learn by doing. The same way, like through DMing. How do you do it? You just do it, and then you'll learn through that. So, I don't know. That seems like bullshit to me, is what I'm saying.
I agree. It's kind of cruel, and it's not very welcoming. And I would probably say that the majority of people that I've played with that have that kind of attitude are Gen X and older, and not necessarily younger than Gen X. And I'm not trying to, just totally crap on people Gen X and older, but
Okay, boomer.
oh, not a boomer. Damn it.
I know. I don't know. I just
I
threw
know.
that in there.
I just don't want anybody else to think I am.
You're
just
not a boomer.
because I'm not a boomer.
Right. Nobody wants to be that.
No, not really. I mean, unless being, debt-free with my education and having a retirement of some sort is what it means to be a boomer, then, I could stand maybe having, gone back on the ideals that I decided I would adopt for that kind of financial and medical security. But other than that, I wouldn't want to be a boomer.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And
no.
there we go. Yeah. Andrew, was there anything else you'd want to add?
Nothing. Nope.
Okay. So at the end, if you're running a campaign, regardless of whether or not it is your own or whether it is something that is pre-made, you have to be prepared. You have to either have the knowledge of your own system and the knowledge of your own world, or you have to invest the time. You have to invest the time to learn about the world that you're going to be running. Thanks for joining us on Game Mastery. You can always check us out on anchor.fm/game-mastery, or follow us on Twitter at mastery_game, Instagram at Game Mastery Podcast, or Facebook and YouTube at Game Mastery. If you'd like to ask us a question or get some follow-up information, maybe submit a topic for the show, please email us at rpg.gamemastery@gmail.com. And we'll be back next week for more information to make your games better and to make you a better game master.